Hi, this is Jack from Team Me, Team Us. I'm doing a video today about how younger people can be better in community with elders. This is mostly aimed at queer and trans younger people, but it also can apply to many other groups as well. Among queer and trans people, it feels like there's an identification that elders were really important in the past. We were the ones who started the Stonewall riots in the 1960s. We were the ones who started communities in Weimar in Germany in the 1920s. But we're all dead now, and so older people are just not important. And that is just not true. It often feels that we are not in proper community with queer and trans people, that we're not palatable, we're not vibrant, we're not entertaining. And so much of queer and trans community, it seems to be revolve around being palatable and entertaining. So elders, we can often feel like we're not really part of that. I'm 55 years old, and that's not really that old for the general community. But for queer and trans people, that is old. And it shouldn't be the case, really. We don't just stop existing once we reach 25 or 30. But it can often feel like that when there's no representation of older queer and trans people. It can often feel like younger people don't really have much of an understanding of what life was like for us before the internet. It feels like the internet is like the cut-off point. Nothing existed before, it's all been since then. And that's just not true for so many people. When I was growing up, there was, in the 70s and 80s, there were things like Section 28 in the UK, where it was illegal for schools and councils to promote queer and trans lives and histories, and just generally speak about it. And that's something that kind of stays with you, really. Even though I just left school when that had started to come in, there's a whole generation of people who that affected, and having to keep all of those secrets, having it be illegal for so much of the time in the UK. Those are hard things to shift, and it may be a bit more difficult for some elders to actually be out and open, even though things have changed quite a bit over time. I was born in 1969, but it was only 2 years previously that it stopped being illegal, or it was decriminalised to be homosexual, and it pretty much only applied to gay men for the most part, and also only in England and Wales. It took a lot longer for Scotland and Northern Ireland and many of the Channel Islands to also decriminalise it. And also, if you were in the armed forces, it was still illegal until very, very recently. So I think things like that, the history of queer and trans people in the UK is not really taught at all in mainstream schools. And it may be hard for younger people to actually accept that this is what life was for us. And it's something that's a completely foreign concept. And that lack of understanding, it can also spiral into, oh, I don't have to know about that. That happened a long time ago, not anything to do with me now. Whereas for people like me and people older than me, that's very much part of our history. Multiple oppressions often get compounded by things like race and age, and it's hard both inside and out of queer and trans spaces to be an older black queer and trans person. There's an awful lot of racism in queer and trans spaces in the UK, and queer and trans white people won't admit that there's a problem, but queer and trans black and brown people will be screaming, there is a problem, please stop, please fix this. And that just makes things really hard when you're trying to be in community with people who won't admit that there's a problem there. There's no issue, we're all together, we're all rainbow coloured, and that's just not true at all. In the wider community, there's a big assumption, which is ageism, but that older people are just asexual, but just without choosing to be asexual, but that's just how they are. They don't have any kind of sexual desires. It's also the case that black people are often seen as straight in the outside communities, unless you're a drag queen or a really out there entertainer. Black people are seen as straight generally, and that feeds into the racism within LGBT plus communities as well. So putting together ageism, wherein old people are celibate, and racism, where black people are straight, when you're a black, queer and trans person, it feels like you're unwelcome everywhere. No one's going to understand where you're coming from. No one's going to believe that you are who you say you are. So it's really difficult, and I'd like younger people to appreciate that. There are lots of assumptions that people of all ages make about older queer and trans people, but this is just going with the younger queer and trans people. It's the lack of understanding and the lack of willingness to learn and to listen to people with different viewpoints, different histories to them. I think there's just this fallacy that people have that they'll never get old. Growing older, changing in different ways, that it's something that happens to other people, not to them. And that's just not true. There's also a real lack of understanding that not everybody knew what their sexual orientation was when they were a teenager or a child. And even if they did know, it can also change over time. There are elders who are coming out in their 50s, 60s or 70s. There are those of us who may have had to hide who they were for their personal safety or that of their families. They may have lived in countries or in regions where being queer or trans is illegal or just really, really frowned upon. So the fact that we are old and queer or trans, and we might only have been that way for a short period of time, I don't think people actually realise that that happens. There is a lot of emphasis on internet culture. That's where you meet up with people, that's where you connect. Or if it's in an outside world, then it's through places like pubs and clubs, and maybe a couple community events that are dry events, as in no alcohol involved. But this can all lead to a lot of isolation for older queer and trans people, for whom the internet is still a pretty new thing. I was 25, I think, when I first used the internet. I think I was maybe 23 when I sent my first email, but that's still, it's not something that I grew up with. It's not something that I'm totally comfortable with all the time. And it's a pet peeve, but it's something that really annoys me with queer and trans communities online, is that everything is referred to pop culture and and it's American pop culture pretty much, or it's connected to anime or manga. And if you don't engage in US pop culture or Japanese anime, then you just left clueless. I've recently came out as asexual. It's coming up to 1 year of being out as asexual after 32 years of being bisexual, and before that 22 years of being straight. There's a lot of things that asexual people have to face that isn't covered by a lot of laws that are supposed to protect queer and trans people. So asexual people are not protected from things like conversion therapy. There's things like sexual violence, physical violence. There's a whole load of things that asexual people have to face. But when I went online, after I came out to myself and a few others, all I saw about asexual people was SpongeBob SquarePants is asexual. And I just thought, and it's a personal pet peeve of mine, but I hate it because it feels like there's so many people talking about this very specific thing that's a work of fiction, but not about things that people are desperately trying to get help with. Age and disability are two things that are more likely to go together. As we age, things change, our mobility changes, chronic health conditions become more common, but disabilities can happen to anybody at any age. But for older people, a lot of places where we could be in community with others, they're inaccessible to us. Either they're in city centres, and if you live in rural places and you don't drive, you're going to be kind of stuck. A lot of them are in buildings, for example in London, where some of the buildings are Victorian or Georgian, or even earlier than that. And these buildings are not known for being accessible or having lifts or handrails even, but they're cheap, and these are the places where a lot of queer and trans events take place. A lot of these events take place late at night. So even if you are in London, trying to get back home safely when an event finishes at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's going to be tricky. And it's also going to be expensive. More recently, the fact that COVID is still with us, it hasn't gone away. But when you go to any event, not just queer and trans, but any event, it will be rare to see someone wearing a mask. It will be rare to see hand sanitizers around. There's just a big spreader kind of community, really. That's not the right word to say, but it feels like there's just a lack of appreciation that when you're older and disabled, you really need to look after your health and not put yourself in situations that are needlessly compromising to your health. This next section is talking about violence, so it's upsetting, but it's something that I think a lot of older queer and trans people face. One of the biggest parts of that is that care homes becoming closets. That a lot of people may have lived their whole lives being out and proud and very happy with that, but when their health changes and they have to go into care homes or long-term hospital stays, that they cannot trust that the staff are going to be clued up, are going to be understanding about it, where, as I said before, there's such an assumption that if you're older, you can't be interested in anything. And if you're black, you're automatically straight. So for an older black queer and trans person, I've got a lot of potential dangers that will be facing me when I go into hospital or a long-term care or medical facility. And it shouldn't be the case at all, but that's a big fear of mine personally, and it's something that I've heard anecdotally from other queer and trans people. And I would like other younger queer and trans people to be aware that this is terrifying for us and that we really do need to be in community with you. But for you to be aware of all of these things and not just brush it off. There are things like domestic violence that is also a concern to older people in general. Yes, there's a physical and sexual violence, but I think for a lot of older people, there's a financial exploitation that in the UK, there's a good chance that we'll be getting welfare benefits, for example, or a pension if we've worked for long enough. And suddenly people who should be caring about us are gaining access to that money or extorting that money from us in exchange for like basic care. And it's a terrible way to exist. It's a terrible thing that happens to countless older queer and trans people, or older people in general. There's the question of who provides the care. In the UK, care is usually provided by family members, but if you're estranged from your family because of your sexuality or your gender identity, who's going to be looking after you? Will you have to be going to a care home that's terrifying for reasons I said before, or will you just be left to fend for yourself? Even in the cases where there is family and that they're not estranged from, will family get involved and take you away from the people that you love? And that could be partners or friends who are queer and trans. Will they want to be respectable, or do they hate queer and trans people and want to keep you away from them? These are all important things, and I want there to be more empathy about that. So what now? How can you be in community with queer and trans elders? Or you can listen to us when we talk. You can amplify our voices and not talk over us or on our behalf. You can be open to our histories and our different points of view and know where we're coming from. You can financially support us by sharing our crowdfunders and donating to them, by getting Ubers or taxis so we can actually attend events, get there and back safely and without having to depend on dodgy night buses, especially if we've got quite a long distance to go. You can actually just be our friends and it won't cost you a penny. You can stop brushing us off. You can actually want to change and want to learn, because older queer and trans people, we also want to be in community with you. So I really appreciate you all listening to my thoughts as a queer and trans old person. So that's goodbye from all of me to all of you.